Hello and welcome to another edition of the China Global South podcast, a proud member of the Sinica Podcast Network. And as always, I'm joined by Cobus Van Staden, managing editor of CGSP, coming to us from Cape Town, South Africa, and our Africa editor, Géraud, joining us from the beautiful island of Mauritius. A good afternoon to you, gentlemen.
Good afternoon.
Well, so much to cover. Normally, we try and deep dive onto one topic, but with everything that's going on today in the world, that's becoming increasingly difficult to do. What we're going to do today is we're going to talk about some of the writing that both Cobus and Géraud have done over the past week, and then pick up on some of the key events that are shaping. I don't even know how to describe it, given the pace of what's going on in various parts of the world. And by the way, so much of what we're going to talk about today, many of you have probably never even heard of or seen, because the narratives are so dominated by what's going on between the United States, Russia, Ukraine, Gaza, and whatnot, that these references that we're going to talk about in today's show on U.S. bribery, for example, or Wang Yi talking about what we think is a potentially significant change in China's development strategy, largely get overlooked in so much of the coverage. So the point here is that we're going to try and bring you perspectives on these stories that you're not seeing in the mainstream conventional news coverage. Cobus, let's start at the Munich Security Conference that took place last week. J.D. Vance, the U.S. Vice President, captured most of the headlines for what a lot of people felt was a very aggressive stance towards Europe in particular. He came out and said that Russia is not the threat, China is not the threat, but internal challenges in Europe are the threat. Culture issues, freedom of speech. He wants to have the right wing more part of the discourse in Europe. You wrote a very interesting column on this this week. Let's start there before we get into Wang Yi's speech. Give us your take on China, the Global South, and the Munich Security Conference.
The basic point I was making was that, Europe's position as a kind of a global power and as a norm setter has been very much supported by its alliance with the United States. Now that position is being shot at essentially from within that circle by J.D. Vance, right? So within this kind of like golden circle of Western privilege, like Europe is kind of being pushed to the side. And at the same time, when Wang Yi was talking, he was calling for like much more neutral, internationalist, kind of globalist institutions. Where countries are there isn't a pecking order between countries, they're all relatively equal, and they're all, it's not kind of located in any particular kind of center of power. So it was an interesting moment where, as J.D. Vance was kind of taking potshots Europe from within the circle of Western power, Wang Yi was kind of essentially doing a similar kind of thing, but from outside. But the effect was that I think it raised the possibility for possible cooperation between Europe and China, particularly in so-called neutral kind of third zones, like parts of the Global South. I argued that it possibly, and again, there's lots of ifs here, but kind of like that it possibly opens a space where European kind of ideas of standard setting and around development, Chinese technological capacity, and African or other Global South demand could actually be crowded into the same space, even if that crowd is a little bit awkward, because everyone feels so kind of alienated by the United States, so they're all kind of scrambling to try and kind of cover their bases, and that now may also include Europe.
So let's take a listen to what Wang Yi had to say, and it was very interesting. And Cobus, I do want to get your take on this. I thought this particular comment that I'm going to play for you was particularly salient. It did not get a lot of coverage. Let's take a listen to part of Wang Yi's speech at the Munich Security Conference.
Called China an enabler, which I find very fitting. With a 5% GDP growth last year, China contributed to nearly 30% of the world economic growth. It has served as an important engine for global economic growth, and shared with the world the benefit of its supersized market. China is willing to synergize high-quality Belt and Road cooperation with the European Union's Global Gateway strategy, so as to empower each other and empower the entire world.
Okay, so that I thought was quite interesting, Cobus, that he said, I want to synergize. I don't know what the word synergize means, but okay, let's say there's a certain kind of alignment. As far as I have been following this issue, as long as I've been following this issue, I have not heard the Chinese make that offer to Global Gateway. What I have heard up until now is criticisms of Global Gateway as an extension of US power and as a way to undermine the Belt and Road. This does feel like, to me, a opportunity that the Chinese are trying to, and this is the Chinese language, to drive a wedge between the US and Europe on this, and using development as an axis that they can maybe try to sideline the Americans a little bit. What was your take on that comment? And then Géraud, start thinking about it, because I do want to get your take on it as well.
Yeah, I tend to agree. In relation to the driving the wedge, the Trump administration doesn't need any help to drive a wedge. They're driving wedges left and right. But it is very interesting to raise this possibility of the BRI and the Global Gateway going together, particularly because it kind of takes a page from the Biden book, right? Kind of where US rollout around like the Partnership on Global Infrastructure Investment was synergizing in similar ways with Global Gateway, in the sense that they're not doing the same thing, but they're doing complementary things with roughly the same kind of game plan. So it's very interesting for that same language and same kind of concept to be applied to the BRI, especially because for such a long time China saw the Golden Gateway or the Global Gateway as a kind of a latecomer trying to dethrone the BRI.
Yeah, Géraud, what's your take on this?
For me, it was quite interesting in a sense where. On the private side of the different conversation I had with different Chinese stakeholders for research I was doing related to Global Gateway and China rivalry and all of that. In those conversations, you'd hear Chinese say, we see the Global Gateway much more as a complementary kind of initiative that we can work with instead of seeing it as a competition, as long as Europe is open to the idea that we can do that together. And the mindset was like, on the China side, we are much more willing to do that, to work with that, as long as Europe see that in that perspective. But if Europe doesn't see that in that way, we're gonna take it the way it is. And I think, if I remember correctly, I think a long time ago, few months ago, there was already a comment made in that regard, an official comment regarding the Global Gateway, where they were saying that China is still remaining open into working with the Global Gateway as long as Europe would like to do that. But having now on the public front, having Wang Yi making that kind of statement in front of the world, in Europe, and during the conference like this, it's really like, we are extending our hand of cooperation, we are extending our hand of partnership, and it really depends on you if you'd like to work with us or not. And this is, I think, it's strong message, because it's also going to undermine this to a certain extent, the language of the geopolitics of Global Gateway, when Europe will go with that in the country, the Global South. How you going to present the Global Gateway? How are you going to keep on presenting the Global Gateway as a tool to compete with China, to rival with China, where, on the other hand, publicly China has made a public offer to work together, to make it to compete, to work together in a complementary way. So this is, I think, the part where it was interesting. It was also a kind of, a trap set in terms of narrative formation, in terms of how now they're going to adapt that narrative in the Global South countries, knowing that on the other hand, the Global Gateway, it's a good initiative, but still having hard time to deliver, because it's still going to find a way to get private sector coming along. So I think it was really interesting, and I'm really quite interesting to see how Europe intends to now move forward with that proposition being made public on a stage like that.
I mean, it's quite remarkable to think that today we're not talking about Build Back Better World. We're not talking about the Partnership for Global Infrastructure Investment, PGII, all these initiatives for the past several years that we've been talking about as these supposed counters to the Belt and Road. They've all but disappeared. I mean, the U.S. is no longer an aid player. So in terms of driving a wedge between the U.S. and Europe, Cobus, to your point, I don't think he has to even try to drive a wedge. There's a giant wedge in the form of Ukraine. There's a giant wedge in the form of J.D. Vance. I mean, there are so many wedges now between the U.S. and Europe that China's just walking right through it. One of the things that I think caught a lot of people's attention was the reception that J.D. Vance got from his speech and the reception that Wang Yi got from his speech. And Wang Yi was well received. And that was very interesting. We also got word this week, or actually over the past few weeks, that a former Chinese ambassador to Germany has held regular meetings with the AfD, which is the right-wing populist party in Germany. It shows that the Chinese are very engaged in what's happening in Europe. And unlike the United States, where they're bracing for what looks like might be a bruising trade war, they clearly see opportunity to partner or to splinter part of Europe to work with them together. I think they see Europe as more manageable right now. The key question, though, for both of you is how does this play in the global South? What is the takeaway from this? If you're sitting in Nairobi or you're sitting in South Africa, what are you looking at when you see these events unfold? First, Cobus, to you, then Géraud, and then we'll move on to another topic.
I think the biggest question that a lot of global South people will ask in private, because maybe not, it would be a bit rude to ask that directly to Europeans, but I think the question would be, will Europe have the money to pay for anything? Because if Europe has to suddenly mobilize additional 3, 4, 5% of its GDP by country to add to collective security, now that the US seems to not be that willing to pay for European security, then it raises some questions about the global gateway. If there is a willingness, I think, to work together, and there is the ability to, then I think a lot of global South countries would be maybe quite enthusiastic about the idea, or relatively enthusiastic about the idea. I think another thing that would have to be worked out is when one looks at global gateway projects, they tend to be quite comprehensive, and they tend to pack a lot of additional things in, right? A lot, they're not similar. They're not like Chinese projects where they're quite lean and focused. They tend to bring issues like regulatory reform in recipient countries, or kind of anti-corruption, or other kind of additional kind of bells and whistles are brought with global gateway deals. So harmonizing the two different styles of deal making, I think, will be another challenge, I think. But in theory, I would assume that a lot of global South countries would be into it, particularly in the context of US assistance, disappearing.
Géraud, what's your final takeaway on the Munich conference?
I think it's opening doors for trilateral cooperations happening in global South, and I think that global South countries should have now developing the tools and the ability to be able to manage those trilateral cooperation happening. And I also can feel the sense of worrying that may happen in the global South, because the idea of seeing China partnering with Europe or US or whatever, in this case in Europe, in global South can bring those kind of memories that big countries are teaming up against us. But I think that it's much more an opportunity if they do, especially since they've been saying from the get-go that we don't want to take a side, we don't want to pick side in the geopolitical wars. Now seeing that China is offering in helping hand, and Europe, if they take that hand and work together, now the question is going to be how countries in the global South are well structured and prepared to deal with this kind of trilateral cooperation to their advantage. And this is, I think, it's an opportunity that it's worth taking, it's worth looking into, but they have to be prepared. And let's not forget that it's really, we are talking about a wide range of kind of topic here, infrastructure, mining, development, health, and everything. So it's going really to be a very interesting approach to see how they're going to manage that, if it ever takes shape and form.
One of Wang Yi's main messages at Munich was the Chinese economy, as he mentioned, is growing at 5%. It is, welcoming imports from around the world, and it was a major engine of growth for the global economy. All of that is true, but there's some fine print here. And I saw a clip from an analyst by the name of Brad Setzer, who is a guy that I would love to get on the show. I mean, when talking about China economics and debt and currencies, this guy is one of the top guys out there on it. He's a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, and he gave a very interesting interview with Foreign Policy magazine that was played on Twitter. And I want to play this interview about why China will not replace the United States as a major economic power. And that's been a key question, Cobus, for you in South Africa, as the prospect, again, not the reality, but the prospect that the South African government may have to follow a similar choice as what Panama did and remove itself from the Belt and Road Initiative and potentially even choose between the US and China. Let's take a listen, and I want to get your reaction to what Brad had to say, thinking about what Wang Yi mentioned at Munich about the role that China plays in the global economy.
I don't accept a lot of the standard foreign policy, not just Foreign Policy the magazine, but foreign policy discussion that says that China can just step in and substitute for the US on trade. Why? China has a very unbalanced pattern of trade. Yeah, it's a lot of countries' biggest trading partner. That's because a lot of countries import with a ton from China. And if you're not making commodities and you're not Taiwan, you're not selling high-end chips, you export next to nothing to China. So trading with China is a heavy lift if you're really trading with China and not just sending goods to China that are going to be sold to the rest of the world. If you're really relying on Chinese demand, that's a tough one if you're not selling commodities, if you're not Australia. The US, by contrast, has been a big net source of demand, big net source of manufacturing demand in particular. So I don't think you can easily swing from trading with the US with our manufacturing deficit to trading with China and its manufacturing surplus. That's kind of point one. Point two is that China is a horrible trading partner. I'm going to sound like Trump. Horrible trading partner for most of the rest of the world. It's been a horrible trading partner for Europe for the past few years. Europe's deficit with China has soared. It's been a horrible trading partner with Korea. It's squeezed Hyundai out of the Chinese auto market. And if you look at Chinese exports last year, in volume terms, exports were up 13, 14%, close to 15%, just rounding up. Imports volumes were only growing at 2 to 3%. That's an enormous discrepancy. So I think the problem for the rest of the world is that if you trade with the US, you have to deal with Trump. And if you trade with China, it's not clear that you're going to actually be able to sell anything other than commodities to China. So in a sense, I think it is difficult, to be honest, to flip to China.
Okay, so there you go. That's something we've been talking about. That is definitely the case in almost the entire global South, where China's trade is absolutely imbalanced. And Jill, we've been talking about this in Africa, where you look at a country like Kenya, $3.8 billion of Chinese imports, $150 or so million of exports. That's what Brad is talking about. And the fact is that Kenya is never going to sell a product like a car or a phone to China. I mean, there's no manufactured good that Kenya is ever going to sell to China. So what does a country like Kenya do? I mean, how do they compete? How do they move up the value chain if what Brad is saying is that they're such a horrible trading partner?
But will Kenya be able to sell any manufactured goods to the US? Because will any African country be able to sell any manufactured good to the US, except for South Africa, maybe?
But bear in mind, I think the U.S. doesn't sell manufactured goods back. The U.S. sells services. It's a tech and finance economy. So I don't know if that comparison is the right comparison there. China and the U.S. are not equal economies here in this respect.
No, because in terms of trade, the way he presented it, was presented in a way that China is terrible because you cannot sell manufactured goods back to China. It did not
correct, which is true. Element. You agree with that, right?
It is true. I agree with that.
Okay.
The reality is, this is a fact. This is the point I was making few weeks back when I was talking about the trade deficit in African countries. The fact that in the case of Africa, it's much more a structural problem that where Africa is standing in the whole global economy. The fact is, when you look into Africa trade and trade balance with any partners, Europe, China, the US, and everything, it's deficits all along. Why? And same profile. Raw commodities exported there. And when you look into, when we talk about, for example, the US and the effort in terms of AGOA, and we look into AGOA, few countries, just like China, few countries are benefiting with that in Africa. It's South Africa. The way South Africa is benefiting with AGOA in the US is the way that South Africa is also benefiting in its trade with China, because South Africa has a much different structural economic situation than any other African countries. But when you remove South Africa out of the equation, you look at all different countries, it's all the same profile. The trade with the trade with the US, with the trade with Europe, the same profile. So we're going with that argument in terms of what can be trades, like basically as I speak from an African perspective, you're like, yeah, I have the same situation whether I deal with Europe or with China, the same thing. The thing is now, is there any structural problem and structural barrier in Europe or in China or in the US that makes that in a way that if today I'm able to produce manufactured goods, I still will be unwelcome to those markets? If it's the case, then we have a conversation, then we have a problem. But if it's still the way we have that our situation right now, I don't believe that being China or Europe, for us Africans, different. It's still the same thing. We still and only exporting raw materials, and our manufactured goods are still not welcome, even in Europe or in the US.
Cobus,
yeah, I think go ahead.
No, I can already see the comments trickling into our YouTube by saying how they hate Brad Setzer and that he's anti-China and that this is terrible.
Yes, I'm expecting that.
I mean, we know that's coming, but Cobus, does Brad have a point? That, okay, and this is not about whataboutism. Are the Americans bad trading partners, or are the French bad trading partners? In the context of China, he's saying for most countries, and not just global South countries, even countries like Korea, it's tough doing business with China just because of the trade imbalances and the manufacturing prowess that the Chinese have. The China price is formidable. That is, other countries are going to find it next to impossible to compete with China in making cars, making electronics, making a lot of the products that they buy. Does he not have a point?
I think he's mostly speaking for the global north. I think he's mostly speaking for Korea, Japan, Europe, I think. And I think in their case, he makes a lot of sense. But most global South countries don't trade with the United States that much, so replacing the United States as a trade partner is not even really the main conversation they're having, right? Because as Géraud was saying, they're facing very similar barriers in other global North markets too, as they do with China. And a lot of them are just facing like trade walls with the US anyway, right? Kind of the US isn't importing lots of like agricultural commodities from these countries, for example, right? So I think the difference, I think, is in here. Like, I think South Africa is an interesting example. I don't think the conversation is replacing, quote unquote, the US or China, whatever that would mean. And I don't think it means I certainly don't think any global South countries have very serious kind of plans to export manufactured stuff to China for all of the reasons that Brad mentions. What China does is allow South Africa to be South Africa, right? Kind of which is if you think about if you've been to the rest of the sub-region, right? Kind of if you've been to places like Botswana, like Namibia, to Mauritius, to the Seychelles, for example, all of these countries around, South African supermarkets, South African brands are everywhere. Right, South Africa is dominating the sub-Saharan region in terms of retail. So what South Africa needs is deals with China to assemble stuff in South Africa so they can just sell it cheaply onto the rest of the continent, and to have Chinese stuff that South Africa needs to run. Right, kind of like, for example, most notably solar panels. So so South Africa can just use the current kind of trade tensions to import as many kind of cheap solar panels as they can, and then the effect will be that they can sell more stuff to Africa, which is where they want to sell anyway.
Okay, but is South Africa maybe an exceptional case here? Because you're right,
yes,
they are a regional power. But let's take other countries in the global South. I mean, take a country that doesn't have the logistics power, the infrastructure that South Africa has, the legal system and whatnot. And also, there's a balance of trade in South Africa. They buy a lot, they sell a lot, because a lot passes through South Africa. That we don't see in the
reason
rest
I
of the world.
mentioned South Africa actually is that South Africa, I think, stands in for this kind of global South middle power that is interested in being a local kind of influence. So South Africa is in a similar position in that sense as Morocco, as Indonesia, as different Latin American countries. It's not the same for Burundi. Being a low income developing country is a different set of issues, right? Kind of a different kind of calculus. But I think even for them, the question, none of them certainly are planning on manufacturing stuff to export to China. But for them, the cheap solar panel logic, I think, still stands. Whatever they want to move on to, in that sense, that kind of infrastructural kind of way, the US wasn't even in that game, right? So in that sense, the Trump stuff doesn't change that much for them. I think in that one respect, I think.
And I can already see the comments saying, "Why is the white American guy harping on China?" And okay, so we'll just we're going to take the arrows as they come. But Géraud, I'm going to stick on this issue because I don't think I 100% agree with Cobus here that China, in many respects, keeps countries at the bottom of the value chain, in part because no one can compete with the China price. We talk endlessly about adding mineral processing in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And the best way to articulate this is that if it costs $5 a pound, for example, to process some cobalt in the DRC, it costs $1.50 a pound in China because of subsidies. Subsidies from the provincial government, subsidies on taxes, on electricity, on water. It's never going to be cheaper to process these minerals and refine these minerals in places like the DRC than it is in China. And China also has a mentality that says, if they do come under competition, they keep lowering the price. That is a very common Chinese business tactic as well. If that's the case, is China not responsible for keeping a country like the DRC at the bottom of the value chain?
I'd say no. Because I do believe that there are many structural problems that justify why countries like mine would be at the bottom of the value chain in terms of those critical minerals. Just a side note, I won't dive into that. The narrative about the subsidies, I really like that, because few weeks back there was reports, I think, published by one of China followers in terms of economic, I think Paul Triolo on Twitter. If I find it, I'm gonna get the name right. But they republished an interesting stories about how they were explaining that subsidies is not the whole story, and it's even becoming the marginal point explaining why China is moving the way it's moving. But that is beside the point. But just to tell you that my point was the fact that no, it's not. China won't be, for me, still won't be responsible, because as I said, I think we had that discussion before. As long as we do have a lot of structural problems behind in terms of our countries, in terms of those countries, in terms of economic industrial policies, the reality is if you remove China out of the equation, you're still gonna have the same problem. It's not like you have strong industry trying to move forward and then they're competing with cheap things coming from China. No, that's not the case. And even when we go into different elements in terms of subsidies, in terms of cost of labor work and everything, we still find that it's cheaper in countries like the DRC, but somehow
labor is only one small piece of the process.
Yes, it's still one piece of the problem. It reminds me another element. For example, Bloomberg released a report 3 years ago, in terms of saying that it's much more cheaper to do EV cathode in the DRC, precursor in the DRC, than doing that in China or in Europe and everything. And it was really explaining that it's much more favorable to do that because it's much more cheaper. The land, the water, all of that is much cheaper. And they even if you include China subsidies into the equation, it's still much cheaper to do that. But somehow we're not doing that because we have other factors coming into the equation that makes it much more difficult to do. That's why I do not. I understand the argument, but I do believe that it's an argument that's very much simplistic because it does not take into account the political, economic, and the decision that different countries in the global south are taking that justify the discrepancies that we do still have in our economies. This, for me, it's much more important that, we know what China is doing and everything, because at the end of the idea of globalization was like, we want cheaper things. And somehow China made it so cheap. Now we are complaining that it's really too cheap for all of us not to buy. It's now hurting us. Where at the beginning, that was the idea.
Yeah, but let's talk very quickly about some of those other things that make it difficult for a country like the Democratic Republic of the Congo to move up the value chain. So we're looking at governance questions, corruption. You're looking at supply chain, logistics, infrastructure. What else are we looking at that would make it difficult? If it's not China, that's the problem. And what is the issue?
Industrial policies, the revenue management. For example, DRC has been benefiting for the last 15 years of an amazing mining boom. But when you look into DRC export basket, you are still shocked that in 2024, 95% of the things that the DRC is exporting is raw materials. I mean, that doesn't make sense when you've been receiving literally billions of dollars in terms of only copper and cobalt, only copper and cobalt revenue for the last 15 years. Where did it go into the economy? It didn't go nowhere. Where did it go? It went 65% went into government salaries, government expenses, and everything. You're like, how does it make sense? And you cannot come 20 years later down the line and say, you know what, I'm still unable to do that. Other countries have been able to do so. You did not do that because your money is not used into diversifying your economy. This is not China problem. This is basically an internal problem with the DRC.
Okay, so just to make you feel a little bit better, I spent the last week in Indonesia at a transition minerals mining conference, and I spent a lot of time in the DRC. We focus on the DRC quite a bit. Indonesia is still relatively new to me, but what was absolutely fascinating, Géraud, is how much of what we see play out in the DRC in terms of how terrible mining is for the economy. It doesn't employ a lot of people. The money goes into the pockets of a relatively few number of people. It doesn't really benefit the society at large. And you've got the resource curse where corruption becomes endemic. All of that is playing out in the nickel industry in Indonesia as well. And one of the key things here is that a lot of people like to blame the Chinese role in this, but it's not the Chinese. And I think you're going to agree, this starts and ends with governance by the host government and by the own. So you can swap the Chinese out and put the French, the Germans, the Japanese in there. The problems will still be the same until the local governance improves. And what was interesting at this conference, and I've heard this among African stakeholders quite a bit as well, is they want the foreign NGOs, they want foreign companies, and they want foreign governments to do more. And they're expressing that because they feel that the avenues to their own government are shut down. So the only hope that they have is to use foreign governments. In fact, there was an event in Washington last year, and I'll skip naming it because it was so atrocious, that a think tank scholar from Ghana came to Washington and said that the Chinese should use their own domestic law to enforce illegal mining in Ghana.
It's so, I'm sorry.
And you think how ridiculous that is. I mean, I know, but because she has given up hope that her own government is going to be effective at cracking down on the galamsey, the illegal gold mining. Why another country
should do that? Why another country?
And this is coming from a Ghanaian. This was from a Ghanaian. This was not coming from a Westerner or even a Chinese.
And this is my point. My point where I'm very, if I feel passionate about it, because I'm very tired and sick and tired of us Africans and people in the global south keep on blaming the external countries. This is the problem. Actually, we don't want to put blame and responsibility to those who have the power, the legitimacy to do what they can do. And this is, for me, it's very frustrating. I mean, come on. How can you say if China's done? That's what I like the answer that China gave when they talk about illegal logging. It was saying, why would you want us, Chinese, to punish our own companies who are coming back with a log coming from the DRC with legal papers. You NGOs are telling us it's illegal, it's through corruptions. But when I look at those papers, legal stamp and everything, why do you want me now to intervene and say, no, based on the report coming from an ex-NGO, your papers are not right? The host countries are not doing anything. And this is my problem. At some point, we should now start to take responsibility and ownership of our own development and our own progress to say, you know what? Leave China alone, leave the US alone. What are we doing wrong? What are we doing right to move forward? And then we can say, okay, I've done everything right, but still not working. Then I can blame the external partners.
And Cobus, this was one of my frustrations when I was, hearing in the Biden administration, and this was even previous Republican administrations, not in the Trump tenures, when they would, single out the Chinese in Africa for all sorts of malfeasance and for all sorts of problems, but never direct any of the attention towards the host governments. For example, on the SGR in Kenya, we know for a fact that based on what Africa Uncensored has reported, that the decision to contract with the Chinese was entirely flawed, that Ruto and Uhuru Kenyatta, the presidents, did not follow Kenyan constitutional law by publishing the contracts and making all this any revelations. But yet when you hear criticism after criticism after criticism coming from the US about the Belt and Road and they talk about Kenya, they only talk about the Chinese. And I think that was counterproductive. They need to hold others to account as well. The same way, by the way, that I think Kenya should be holding the Americans to account now for their lack of governance as well. This is not a one-way street.
It's patronizing.
It's totally patronizing. Totally patronizing.
Because it's like saying that we agree that those Africans are kids, they will never do things right. You China you are the grown-up, you should know better. This is the patronizing. No. Hold African leaders accountable. You should do something. You have all tools at your disposal to do something, and not doing that just like saying we already established that African leaders are so corrupt that it's just waste of time trying to convince them. We're just gonna keep on dealing with them the way they are. This is patronizing.
Yeah. What's your take on this?
I think what's revealing about that tendency, and I agree with you, that is like we've heard that many times, is I think what underlies that is the kind of tacit assumption that the only reason why they're talking about African corruption to begin with is because China is involved, right? Yeah. So it's a very convenient way to blame China for more things. And it's also, a way to not talk about the fact that corruption has been very convenient in maintaining kind of Western grips on power in the developing world. Corruption is no accident, and it ends up being a kind of a cheap way of maintaining a form of control, right? Much cheaper than, say, having to provide, kind of knowledge transfer and equity transfer to, to a well-running global South government that demands the best for its people, right? It's much cheaper to pay off a few people and then, and then keep it moving. So in that sense, for Western powers to now be all shocked about African corruption and China's nefarious influence.
Okay,
it's like,
well,
come on. For decades, Gabon was the biggest importer of French champagne in the world, right? For decades. So
yeah,
give me a break.
Okay, this is a perfect segue into our next topic that Géraud covered this week. Speaking of corruption, this might have been one of the many executive orders that President Trump signed in the past week or so that you may have missed, but he paused, I think is their word, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Let's take a listen to the exchange that Donald Trump had, and then we're going to talk about what Géraud had to think of this.
Just really a waste.
Thank you, sir. Next, we have an executive order relating to the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. As you've repeatedly identified, the way that this act has been enforced over the years has been devastating to American business opportunities and business competitiveness abroad. We are essentially ordering the Department of Justice to use its prosecutorial discretion in a way to ameliorate the negative effects of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, to allow Americans to do business abroad and to allow our foreign partners to do business with Americans without fearing unjust prosecution.
And for those of you that know this, it turned out to be, it sounds good on paper, but in practicality, it's a disaster. It means that if an American goes over to a foreign country and starts doing business over there legally, legitimately, or otherwise, it's almost a guaranteed investigation, indictment, and nobody wants to do business with the Americans because of it. Nobody wants to do business. They say, look, we can deal with China. They can do whatever they want. We can deal with Russia. We can deal with anybody. And we have a normal life. You deal with America, the FBI gets over there. They don't investigate death and murders on the street in New York and Los Angeles. They go over and investigate a business guy trying to do business. So it made it very, very hard from a practical standpoint to make deals. They want to deal with the Americans, but they don't want to be under investigation every time they speak to American, every time an American makes a phone call to somebody in a different country. It's a disaster for this country. And I guess it was a Jimmy Carter concept, and it sounds so good, but it's so bad. It hurts the country, and many, many deals are unable to be made because of it. Nobody wants to do business because they don't want to feel like every time they pick up a phone, they're going to jail. So we'll sign this, and it takes courage to sign it because you only get bad publicity when you sign it. It sounds so nice. The title is so lovely. But it's an absolutely horror show for America. So we're signing it because that's what we have to do.
Okay.
Make it good.
So Géraud, you took to you did not agree with that. Let's be very clear. The Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, he is vastly overstating what would happen. So every year it was between 6 and 10 companies that were prosecuted for bribery. 6 to 10. I mean, this is less, this is just fewer than a dozen companies every year. The fear of being prosecuted was what kept a lot of American companies in check. One of the things that I heard, which echoed what you wrote, Géraud, last week in Indonesia, where I spoke with somebody and they said, well, the cost of business for the Americans just went up because guess what? It's payout time. You're going to have to pay up. I mean, now that beforehand the FCPA kept the Americans kind of like, well, I can't do this because of that law. Now, guess what? The cost of business just went up. You wrote about this, why Trump's decision to axe the FCPA isn't going to help U.S. business as much as he thinks. You also wrote about this in French as well. Why don't you give us your take on this and tell us what you think and why this generated so much attention for you in particular?
My take is that I think he really put, my take is the fact that he put it on very under a geopolitical perspective by saying, you know what, because when you talk about competitiveness, when you talk about China,
and he mentioned China by name, by the way.
Exactly,
he specifically mentioned
China by name. China and Russia, they can do whatever they want, but us, we cannot do. Basically, it says that if we go to a country where it's very notoriously corrupt, it's really difficult to do business there. If the way of doing business is doing X and Y, Z, American companies should be allowed to do X, Y, Z without fear of being prosecuted. But he did not say that. This is between the line that you understand what he was saying about that. And my point was like, no, this is a very bad idea because it's going to backfire. The first backfiring is the fact that, yes, many American companies who've managed to enter difficult market and being able to survive and to thrive, they were protected. They were able to tell, corrupt leaders, you know what, I cannot pay you because if I do, I'm going to be under prosecution and I might close business here. If I close business here, it means that no employment for you, no tax revenue for you and everything. So you better have me here creating job, employment and paying taxes than not having me at all. So what means that you leave me alone. That was it. Chinese company were the easy target because, we're not going to debate the way you do business. You know what, you're going to, do whatever. We're going to pay what we need to pay. And here, and I made a video about that. It's very important to tell people that because before people coming and say, you know what, who said that Chinese companies are corrupted? I'm just going to say Xi Jinping himself said that last year when he said, you know what, we need to clear corruption out of the BRI. It means that even Chinese themselves, they recognize that in the BRI, there are Chinese companies who are paying bribes to foreign officials, and that needs to stop. So yeah, saying that means that even Chinese companies were willing to pay and everything. So that is just a bad concept. It's a bad solution because at the end, what is going to happen? few companies are going to make money. You go, you take business deals and everything, you enrich yourself. But at the end, corruption is going to become much more stronger and rampant, and it's going to expand. Because now it means that every company is now operating in very difficult jurisdiction. Every American company is now a target. Now we do know that you can pay up. Now we do, especially in the mining, because when you look, you read into the text, they mention infrastructure, deep sea port, and critical minerals. It just tells you that because there was a lot of discussion beyond closed doors where many mining executives are saying that you want us to be a tool for U.S. foreign policy in critical minerals, but the countries where we need to go are countries where the way of doing business is going to put us in difficulties here back home. And those companies have been really lobbying hard to have those, the FCPA law post. And then now you have this kind of situation where they know we can go into the DRC. What do you want, this and that? But the thing is,
you got to
pay. Not expecting a lot of more money.
You got to pay now. I mean,
we know that you can pay out.
I would hate to be the executives at Freeport McMoran in a country like Indonesia, because guess what? Their cost of business just went up. Cobus, it is remarkable to think that in the past couple of weeks that, over the years that you and I have been doing these shows, that some, two of the most prominent, moral high grounds that the Americans took vis-a-vis the Chinese in places like Africa and other parts of the global South. One was humanitarian assistance, that the Chinese just didn't provide aid. And I remember guest after guest saying, listen, American aid has been vital to the lives of millions of people across the global South. Guess what? That's gone. The other one was corruption. And the FCPA was a tool that the United States used to differentiate itself from the Chinese. And to say, and you've heard, one secretary of state after another go to Africa and say, well, the Chinese are corrupt. That was the line that they used in part. They don't have that anymore. Now, to be clear, it's a pause. It's a suspension. You heard the gentleman before say that they want the Justice Department to use their prosecutorial discretion. So it's still on the books. And in many ways, this speaks to the weakness of these executive orders. These are not laws. This is the weakest form of regulatory, tool that they have, because the next president can simply wipe it out. They can do, so it's very easy to undo. But when we think about American soft power vis-a-vis the Chinese, it feels like they're ceding so much ground. I mean, they're giving it away.
I mean, the differential prosecution also opens the door for pressure on American companies from within the US, right? Kind of so it adds another kind of government lever of potential control, I think, over the private sector.
Actually, let me hold you there. Can I just stop you there for one very quick point, because Géraud wants to make this point that what you were saying, Géraud, is just to what Cobus said here, that it was not only about American companies, but companies like Glencore also came under the web of the FCPA as well.
Yeah, any companies operating in the US, if they're also operating in the US, you are under the FCPA. That's why, for example, there was if Glencore was also cut in that. That's why also all the different hedge fund that also cut into that web, because they're operating in the US, so they're under that same law. So basically, it's now opening doors, allowing those companies to be able to maneuver, to move around, and that's just Eric. You mentions the fact that, now we can, I think the idea is to say, when the prosecution, the Department of Justice, is going to look at that, the question is to be, does it advance national security for the US? Does that company did that to acquire a critical mineral somewhere in the DRC, in Chile, in Bolivia? If the answer is yes, close your eyes, turn a blind eye, let's move forward, because this is national security. I think Cobus, this is the mindset.
Cobus, I cut you off. Can you continue your thought?
Yeah, I think what is an interesting irony, I think, in that, the language is all about American exceptionalism, but I think the effect both of the aid and of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act has been to provincialize the United States, right? Kind of to make it more like just another country, rather than this shining exception to everything, kind of this, because the combination of those laws and the size of the American market always meant that the US was this huge exception to whatever whatever you were saying about foreign companies, whatever you were saying about how the world works. The US was always a special case because of this kind of combination of its size and then it's some of these practices. Now that the practices are now that these kind of laws and and conventions are being taken away, the US is essentially changing into just another country, right? Kind of So in that sense, I guess from a Trumpian perspective, there's this kind of leveling of the playing field, I guess. But it also, I would be very interested to hear a kind of an unvarnished behind the scenes response from US kind of senior corporate officials on what exactly they're winning and losing.
Yeah.
In this case, because it sounds to me like it's going to make stuff harder for them rather than easier. Maybe. Yeah. It may make new deals easier, but it's going to make continuing work harder, I think.
Much more difficult, yes.
Yeah, it would be interesting to talk to the Chamber of Commerce in Washington to see if this is something that they actually want. Remember that a lot of the decisions that Trump is making are not pro-business. The tariffs, for example, are really not pro-business. The crackdown on illegal immigration in the United States is not pro-business. A lot of the workers at these places. So it's entirely possible that he's making these decisions without
for
consulting
specific industries. I think
maybe for specific industries, but he's not making these decisions necessarily in consultation with key American stakeholders.
Yeah, I do believe that it's really targeting specific companies, those who are going to be protected, those may be behind closed, they've been lobbying, you know what, we want to go to this country, but this and that, how can you allow us to move forward? Those companies will be protected. For the remaining one, I think they're still going to continue to implement the FCPA because, as mentioned, discretionary power is going to really decide whether you prosecute this company and not this one. And I think that's what's going to happen. And to the point that Cobus made, I think for him, like, what's the point of being exceptional if you're not winning? For him, is that we need to win. We need to be able to be competitive. For me, being, aid and good governance doesn't make me win, just make me exceptional. I don't care of being exceptional. I just want to win, and I want to play the same thing. And to what Eric was saying, you remember last year, Anthony Blinken was saying about critical minerals, we are not going to make the rest at the bottom. Basically, with Trump, he said, if you go low, we are going to go even lower with you because we want to win. We don't care.
And just in terms of American soft power, I think that is the biggest issue.
That's what I'm saying. They just ceded that ground. Yeah, they just ceded that ground.
But it's not even the issue of ceding particular areas or or even weakening aid or so on. The biggest hit to U.S. soft power is this effect of you can imagine now, say, American stakeholders saying anything. There's no American story anymore, right? There's no central American truth that's being told anymore. And from they can be pro corruption, anti-corruption, pro authoritarianism, anti-authoritarianism, anything, right?
Exactly.
So there is this kind of thing of who cares what America says because you can't believe them anyway. It becomes the kind of underlying thing.
And from the business perspective, you have Chinese going the other way, saying we want to fight corruption in the BRI, where Chinese say, you know what, we know the cost of corruption in those businesses. Now we want to fight it, and this is very interesting to see now that dynamic taking place.
But Géraud, yes, you are right that Xi Jinping did, allocate the internal Communist Party anti-corruption units to the Belt and Road, but we also know, and it's well documented, that Chinese business practices in places like the DRC, in Mali, and elsewhere are rather opaque, and corruption is a part of the toolkit that they use. We know that
anti-corruption crackdowns are a political tool in China, not necessarily always aimed at actual corruption.
And by the way,
that's also a reality.
And also, the Chinese do have a version of the FCPA on their books that they don't enforce either. So I think that point should be made as well. I just don't want to glorify the Chinese that they are doing something great and the others are not, because the Chinese, to be fair, you're right. They've cleaned up the BRI. There's no doubt that contractors on the BRI have had to adhere to much higher standards. That is not universal for all Chinese businesses around the world. I want to make one last point on this, Géraud, that you brought up in your piece, that the impact of this is only going to exacerbate the problems in the poorest countries in the world where wealth inequity is already severe. It's going to make corruption worse. It's going to centralize money into the hands of the few. The impact of the end of the FCPA means an expansion of corruption in places that don't need any more.
Exactly. Yeah. It's not going to help anymore. It's going really, civil society are going to be lost now, because civil society could still hang on to the practice of American companies to say, you know, we can rely on those companies to be, you know, those at the edge and the front to fight against corruption. But now they don't have it anymore. Now you're just going to have a widespread corruption happening where the elites, the few political elites, are going to be the ones winning at the end, because the markets and the businesses and all the deals are going to be attributed to the ones going to have the deeper pocket. And if at the deeper pocket you get the win, you win you win the business. At the end, corruption is going just to be more rampant. And this is, I think, the cynical perspective of that executive order is basically saying that it's not our duty to come in your country to save you from yourself. If you don't want to do business in a regular way, we don't care. If you want us to play the way you want us to play, we're gonna play. Whether that's going to to just make corruption even worse, we don't care. As long as for us we win, it's just enough for us.
Okay, I need to wrap up very soon because we want to keep this under an hour. We know that our audience drops off sharp after an hour. So thank you, gentlemen. But I'm going to close on. Again, I don't want to make light of this because it's very serious. And we've been talking a lot about Trump over these past few weeks because of what's happening, and it's so transformative. But this happened on February 15th, that the president talked again about BRICS. It's very much on his mind that he's concerned about BRICS, creating some kind of alternative currency. Let's be very clear here. The Russians, the Brazilians, the South Africans have all said there is no movement whatsoever to create a BRICS currency. It is not in discussion. There's talks about improving cross-border payment systems, their QR codes, industrial parks, lots of small things. But the president this week, commented once again and said something absolutely remarkable. As you're seeing here on this tweet, he apparently does not know that China is a part of BRICS.
BRICS, the BRICS nations, I think that's breaking up very rapidly. We said that if they're going to go and do anything to undermine the dollar, that includes China. I don't even know that they're a member of BRICS, but they had a few nations get together to try and play cute. And I said, we're going to put 100% tariff on every one of those nations. And at the mere thought of saying that, I think that's all broken up. That idea has no longer sailed. Now, that would be a terrible thing for our country. It would be bad for the world. They wanted to undermine the dollar. Six nations.
Okay,
BRICS,
so
BRICS nations.
He's not going to put 100% tariffs on the BRICS because that would mean 40% of the GDP of the world, including India, and Indonesia, would be under would be under 100% tariffs. I mean, this is just nonsense. He's also saying that the BRICS is kind of breaking apart and things like Saudi Arabia too. The BRICS is breaking apart. There's no evidence of that. The BRICS is actually gaining momentum, and especially with, the BRICS Plus community growing. We know at least about 40 countries are in line to join the BRICS in some form or another. What strikes me, Cobus, as so odd is that this is a man who has a political genius of magnificent proportions. He has transformed the United States single-handedly. He has, taken over an entire political party. He is one of the most consequential presidents in American history. And yet some very basic facts, like who's a member of the BRICS that he goes on television to talk about, he doesn't know. That contrast is something very difficult for me to get my head around. How someone with such political genius can be also so politically or just intellectually stupid. Again, not knowing that China's a part of the BRICS is just an ignorance that's stunning. I can't reconcile those two things at once. I give him an enormous amount of credit for his political genius, and he is a political genius on many levels. But to make a mistake like this just feels shocking to me.
I guess, but I think that is part of it. That what you call
maybe that's part of the appeal, right?
That's always the thing, right? It's not only that it's part of the appeal, but it's always to wrong-foot people, right? Kind of to always kind of like make smart people feel dumb, make dumb people feel smart, make kind of like it's always that's always his tactic, because he always tries to zag when you think he's going to zig, and that comes with the kind of quote unquote expected knowledge that that a president is supposed to have. I guess that's like it'll be his strength until it turns into his weakness. And by which time the gears of power in the US will have shifted in some way, and who knows what.
We haven't seen it. We really haven't seen a weakness. Géraud, I'm going to give you the last word on the BRICS, on Donald Trump and what we've seen. I feel bad that we keep talking about Donald Trump. I don't want to only talk about Donald Trump every week, but I'm afraid we keep having to do it because it's a big deal. I mean, there's just no other way around it. What are your final thoughts on this, Géraud?
I remember last year, the idea of him coming back to power was kind of wondering what's going to happen. And I think I've made a comment to say him back in the White House is going to give us a lot of content to talk about. And so far he's delivering. And
not disappointing on that front at all.
He's not disappointing, he's really delivering. And for me, him not knowing about the BRICS, it's just, as you said, the political genesis of him is basically just, I don't care about the rest of the world. I just care about what's happening in the US.
Yeah.
And for me, I'm very US centered. Me not knowing that China is part of the BRICS, I don't care. For me, China is there, Russia is there, whether they're BRICS or not, I don't care. For me, I'm US centered. That's why I think for him, it doesn't even feel the weight as like people like us be like, how come you don't know about China being in the BRICS? I don't care. What does it change? For me, what does it change that I'm going to put 25% tariff on China? And that's it. And I don't care. And I think for him, that's
I think you've made a very good point. And I don't want anybody to misunderstand my critique as being, again, we're not anti-American, we're not anti-Chinese. I'm baffled by it. And, and I know, I'm just baffled by the knowledge gaps and at the same time, the genius that is there and what he's been able to do, So again, I don't say that praisingly, but that is an objective fact that he is a consequential president. Go ahead, Cobus.
I'm not so surprised by that because I lived through the Zuma era in South Africa, and I think Zuma is the strongest and kind of analogy to Trump. I mean that seriously. I think Zuma, like South Africa, in many ways, that's South Africa's uncanny quality is it tends to foretell the future, and it has in this case. Like both the kind of structural effect that Zuma has had in South Africa, I think will be replicated under Trump in the US, but because the US is so much bigger, the effect will be much bigger. But that was a similar kind of thing of like this kind of thing of like saying calculatedly ignorant sounding stuff in public to reinforce the point that what actually counts is connections and leverage, and he has plenty. So that was always the message that Zuma was sending through all of his many gaffes also. None of which hurt him, similar to Donald Trump, because everyone knew that it was code for something else. It was a way of signaling strength, not weakness. So and I worry that the US don't know what they're up against.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point to
because once the institutions shift, once the society shifts, it's not coming back.
Yeah, well, that is a depressing thought, at least for me as an American. But gentlemen, I want to thank you both for your insights and your great writing this week. You can find all of their work over on the China Global South website. Just go there. If you'd like to support the work that we're doing and to help support the journalism that Géraud, Cobus, Edwin, Lucy, the whole team in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East are doing, just go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe. Also, don't forget that if you are a student or a teacher, and we're just so thrilled with the uptake by students and teachers around the world to the work we're doing. And since the Trump administration has come back, there's been more interest. Our subscriptions have gone up. So I'm very excited about that. Email me, eric@ChinaGlobalSouth.com, and I will send you the discount links for half off subscriptions, just $10 a month. So let's leave it there, gentlemen. We'll be back again next week with another episode of the China Global South podcast. I apologize for a couple of weeks. We've been off because of my travels, but we will get back onto a regular cadence now. So for Cobus van Staden in Cape Town, and also for Géraud in Mauritius, I'm Eric Olander. Until next week, thank you so much for listening. Bye for now.
Bye-bye.